Hello, and welcome to our November edition of the Cinetopia radio show and podcast. I'm Amanda, and I run Cinetopia, and I'm here with some of our regulars again. I'm here with Jim Ross, co-producer of the show. Jim, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good to be back.
And back with Simon Bowie. Is it Bowie? Bowie doesn't.
Either works.
All right, Simon. How are you? How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks. Been a stressful few weeks, but yeah, back at it, ready to watch some films.
Yes. And Steph, we're back with you as well. Steph, it's been a while. How have you been?
Good, thank you. Yeah, it's really good to be back. Happy to see everyone again, and just looking forward to the holiday season. Where there shouldn't be too much going on.
Yes, and we'll hopefully be talking about next month's maybe Christmas challenge I've just come up with. But we're not going to focus on Christmas and the holidays yet. We're going to focus on 3 films that are currently out. And that is the Banshees of Inisherin, directed by Martin McDonagh. It's been out for a couple of weeks. We're also going to review The Oil Machine. It's directed by a local filmmaker, Emma Davey, and will be shown at Summer Hall later this week. And we're also going to be reviewing Causeway, a debut feature by Lila Neugebauer. Also, as we discussed on the last month, there's quite a lot of a lot of things shaken up in the Edinburgh cinema landscape with the loss of the Film House and the CMI going into administration. So I spoke with Patty, Ali, and Belle, who are the organizers of the former CMI Staff Welfare Fund. So we've been talking about that because it's really important to highlight the work that they're doing and for us to support it. You can support it at savethefilmhouse.com. That's where you can find the fund. And so if you don't get to that interview, just go there right now. And then we also spoke with Jim Hickey, who was the director of the Film House from 79 to 93. So we really want to talk a little bit about the history and what's at stake, given that we have lost that wonderful space at this moment. How is everyone feeling? I know it's been a kind of a really chaotic month in terms of, yes, illness and lots of things and the world, but also particularly around this cinema landscape and arts landscape in the UK and beyond.
Pretty grim, to be honest. I think it's hard. So the Save the Film House campaign is kind of up and running. There's a Google group going there, and it's heartening to see so many people who are keen to, fight for, keeping some sort of cinema provision like that in Edinburgh. That's good. It's heartening to see, right? I think since then, there's a cinema in Wolverhampton, the Lighthouse, which has kind of gone a similar way, just even since we did the last show. And when you see that combined with that, I made a big thing on the last show and on social media about this can happen anywhere in the country outside London, but even then I've even saying that the Curzon Mayfair is apparently going to get because it's going to be sold off for flats or something. So even that qualifier, the outside London part is not 100% accurate. So I'm not gonna lie, I'm feeling a bit grim about it. I think it's good that so many people are feel so passionate about trying to maintain it, and I think that's needed. But the situation is still pretty precarious, and I don't feel that great about it. So yeah, a slightly depressing outlook, but hopefully we manage to get somewhere and keep this in the news and in people's minds. I think the grassroots response is great. The institutional response has not been, I don't think. But
yeah, it's really disheartening. There's an article in this month's Sight and Sound about the Film House situation and the charity that owned it, which hopefully should bring it some recognition in the lot of UK cultural sector discussions. But it's really, really disheartening. For Aberdeen as well, like the Belmont Film House in Aberdeen is a cracking wee cinema. I've been there more often than I've been to the Edinburgh Film House, so I've got more attachment to it. But that's a real loss for the city. So I was, on my side, glad to go to Glasgow Film Theatre over London Film Festival, where it was parallel showing things, and the main screen one was just packed for all of the showings I went to. So that was quite heartening for the kind of Glasgow film scene. But it's everyone here is very, very concerned about, like Jim said, it can happen anywhere.
Yeah, I think in Scotland it is horrible, and I think what's worse is it's always kind of been coming, the arts sector, and thing kind of gets brushed over. There's just not enough investment, and there's not really enough concern about it. What's sad, I suppose, is not just that we're losing cinemas, but we've also lost a film festival for people that really do support independent film and really want to see new filmmakers having their voice out there and having new stories make the screen. There's it's going to become more difficult for filmmakers in Scotland to get commissioned and things, and it's just going to be. I think that, like Jim said, it's good that we're having a great grassroots response, but we need a bigger response. That we just need to get, especially people in government, to address it more than they are. I think that's really all that I can really say about it at the moment. But yeah, it is disheartening.
Well, yes, I completely agree. I think getting the word out as much as possible. I've been somewhat involved in the campaign, but also involved with some of the projections that were put out. As mentioned, you'll be hearing from the organizers of the GoFundMe welfare fund, which is part of the campaign, but something that you should support in any case if you can, in any way. But I think it's about getting the message out on how you feel about spaces, like cultural spaces. Let's just say art spaces in general. It's not just film spaces, and how valuable and important they are. And from my standpoint, I'm doing my best to buy my coffees and glasses of wine and whatnot at every arts institution I can support right now. That's a huge portion of a lot of times their income is the bars and cafes and stuff like that. So whatever I can do to support I will be putting into as many arts institutions as possible.
I'd also encourage I mean, admittedly, maybe the audience for this radio show and podcast kind of already knows these things, but I would encourage folk to go on to the Save the Film House website and just read some of the stuff there. In particular, I think one that's definitely worth looking at is the discussion about the projection team at the film house. And I think it kind of gets across what I've banged on a lot about, kind of like we have lost more than a cinema, and I think it's kind of a nice little micro example of that, to read like where the expertise was, why it was different to the other cinemas in the city and even the country. The ability to show things on 35mm and 70mm. And also, like, how big that team was. It wasn't big, it was small, but like where they'd come from. I mean, some of them were former front of house staff who then learned these skills. And, it's all this sort of thing that's been lost. So I think it's worth going on reading that sort of thing, because I think my big thing with this is I think a lot of people outside the bubble can view it as, oh, well, people didn't go and it was expensive. It's like, no, we have lost more than that. And I think showing people those examples of it really kind of gets that across. And I think it's also important for the whole idea of this GoFundMe. I mean, what we are potentially losing is not just jobs, it's the skills with those jobs. It's the skills with those jobs, and or taking those skills and applying them to this industry. I mean, people can go elsewhere. Like, you lose people from the industry, you lose people from this sector. And as I said on the previous show, once you lose these things, it's very hard to get them back. It's very hard.
I'd agree. And I also think, I think about like organizations like the university that have these, master's programs, or these programs that bring the opportunity was really at places like the Film House. Not only did the universities use the Film House as sort of an extension to their, their space. They showed, the film departments would, show films throughout that, or, the Film Guild was a large part of working with the university. So they didn't have to have their own cinema, which I think is kind of sort of sad in itself, that the University of Edinburgh doesn't have its own cultural center or cinema, and, like for the students. But where are those graduates looking to go, in terms of new potentials for jobs? This was really where young, like you said, people might have started off in front of house or started in a certain position and stayed on. And, you have 25, 30 years of experience that now there's not, they need to maybe potentially go somewhere else, then a city like this loses that skill set, or those skilled workers. And it's really sad. So the first film we're going to review is The Banshees of Inisherin. And Jim, why don't you tell us about this film?
Yeah, so this is directed by Martin McDonagh, who I think most people would probably know from directing In Bruges. He's a former, well, I say former playwright, I mean, he's still a playwright, but that's basically how he made his name. But then since then, he has made a bunch of films, 4 feature films, this being the 4th. So he started off with In Bruges, which was a very big hit, and I think has become a bit of a cult mainstay. 7 Psychopaths after that, which I liked. I don't think a lot of people necessarily did. I think Steph mentioned earlier she quite liked it. I think we must be one of the 2 of the dozen people worldwide who seem to actually genuinely quite enjoy it. 3 Billboards, which I thought was very good, and I think the general consensus on it is that it has had a bit of a reassessment in recent years in terms of how it handles some of its characters and ideas. But basically, this one is basically taking McDonagh back to Ireland. It reunites the lead pair from that first feature In Bruges with Colin Farrell and Brendan Gleeson. And it is set on a fictional island just off the coast of Ireland called Inisherin during the Irish Civil War. And it basically focuses on the relationship between Brendan Gleeson's Colm Doherty, who is a sort of a local folk musician, and his friend and pub-going pal, Podrick. For all of the Irish Gaelic speakers out there, I will not attempt to pronounce Podrick's surname. And basically the film opens with Podrick going to call on Colm, as he does at 2 p.m. every day to go to the pub, and Colm doesn't answer his door and just ignores him. You can see him sitting inside. And Podrick's sister, Siobhan, jokes maybe he just doesn't like you anymore, and that turns out to be true. He's decided that Podrick is a dull man who is basically a drain on his time, and he wants to use the time he has left to write music and try and do things that will mean he is remembered, because nobody will remember his aimless chats with a limited man, as he puts it. Now, basically, this then kind of develops and escalates from there. We can decide how much we want to talk to as we go along, but basically it's a very contemplative building film. It has that same sort of black comedic feel to it that I think mainly In Bruges and 7 Psychopaths had the elements of it in 3 Billboards, but it feels more akin to In Bruges in that sense than his previous films. I think it's got 2 very good central performances, but I mean, you got to find out what everybody thought of it.
So I loved it. I really, really enjoyed it. I think it's got a fascinating kind of texture in that it's a very funny film. It's really laugh out loud funny at points, but there is this deep kind of melancholy that comes through in both the performances, like you say, and the limitations of life on this island and in the Ireland of the time. So it's really got these different layers, these different textures that I think really work incredibly well. It feels like a play. The script feels like a play, a chamber piece, with quite a small cast, really. I mean, they're all on this island together. There's not many outlets for them to get out into the world, but it feels like a play. And I was unsurprised to learn that it is a play that Mike McDonough wrote early in his career and abandoned, and has come back to as a film. However, saying that, there is also these kind of sweeping vistas of, a mist-covered island off the coast of Ireland that just look terrific, and that really lend it this kind of rural, gothic-y quality. Really interesting film, and I just loved it. Like, one of my favorite films of the year.
Yeah, I really really enjoyed the film as well. I think that I agree with Simon. I think that I love the kind of theatre like quality to it. I didn't realize until today that it is based off a play that was in the works and is now being sort of translated on the screen. I think that I think it works really well in this sense, and I think that the vistas and the imagery and things that really help reflect these characters' life in this kind of deep isolation. And I think that's a lot of where the comedy comes from. It is dark humor, but it is really funny. I think it's a really well balanced narrative, and I think that the benefit of kind of using obviously what was written in the format of theatre has really helped elevate kind of where there is kind of a lot of absurdism kind of that kind of weaves through throughout the character of Colin especially. Yeah, it's definitely I think that this one's going to be quite an interesting piece for people that are quite familiar with Seven Psychopaths or In Bruges or Three Billboards, because I think that I agree with Jim that it goes probably more far back to his earlier work, but I think it does stand out in many ways as well. I think probably because it has come from theatre. But yeah, it's so bizarre, and I think that I do think the central performances are excellent, but I also think Barry Keoghan's performance in that film was one of the best. I think ever since that you've seen him in earlier works, when we go back to The Killing of a Sacred Deer. I forget the other one that I seen recently. I think I was talking about it with Jim quite a while ago. But he's fantastic, and I think that I think that the oddball characters as well really elevate the texture of this film. You have the kind of village idiot, the gossipy neighbors that can't mind their own business, and then you've got this kind of really bizarre separation between two what is kind of inferred to be quite long-term friends. But it's really intriguing. It's definitely one that I think that it's something that if you watch, you might have a completely different perspective each time that you see it. I think it's got so many layers. But yeah, I would definitely recommend everyone catch it as soon as they can, really.
Yeah, I think Barry Keoghan gives a great performance as well. But there's also a terrific performance, I think, from Kerry Condon, who's Podrick's sister, and she's kind of the straight woman of the piece. She's sensible, she's level-headed. She is, I think at one point she just says she's bored of being on this island with these dull men surrounding her. And she gives a really important grounding performance to the kind of absurdity going on around her. It's really good. Really, really strong performance. I couldn't remember seeing her in anything else.
Yeah, I think I just want to back Simon up on Kerry Condon's performance, because I'd even go so far as to say that her role is kind of critical in this working, really, right?
Yes.
Because I think one of the things that's quite interesting about the dynamic between the characters is the way that you kind of go back and forth with who you feel sympathy for. Kerry Condon's performance as Siobhan is something where it kind of pivots around it a little bit. She's the as Simon said, the straight person of the piece, really, in the sense that she's not engaging in absurdity. She has her own conflict in this story, her own kind of emotional thing to deal with, but it's slightly more grounded, and it does put a slightly different spin on this. It's not any coincidence that it's set during the Irish Civil War. I mean, I think some people would probably read it as a kind of this conflict is kind of a metaphor for that. I just find a very good film to just sit and observe those performances. Like, I think Brendan Gleeson is absolutely superb. I think Colin Farrell. So I spoke about After Yang on the show, right? He's had a couple of films out this year where I think he's done really, really great work. After Yang is one of them. I think he's excellent here as well. I mean, like, just it's very hard not to kind of like feel sympathy, get emotional when just like, you know, he has a conversation and he's knocked back by Coleman. He just looks absolutely devastated. You know, he really, really sells this role, and and it goes across the whole cast. I mean, even Steph talking about Barry Keoghan, like there's one part there where he just kind of, the line delivery is just incredible. He says sort of like, "There goes that dream," right? I'm not going to give the context as to what he's talking about. He says, it just says, "There goes that dream," and it's absolutely crushing. It is absolutely crushing. I find it quite a hard film to talk about because I feel like you come away from this film with more of a feeling than you do kind of like an idea about, you know, something, or you come away with this, it generates this sort of feeling and empathy, which I think is something that will sit with you for a while rather than necessarily an idea about something. And I think that's actually quite impressive in a way.
I pretty much, I think the one who I liked this film the least is everybody here. Not that I disliked the film. I mean, I am a huge fan of sweeping Irish like island sort of views, and the donkeys and the, you know, animals and the dogs and everything. And Colin Farrell, I agree, is incredibly doing really well right now and in terms of the films that he's doing, and this was a great performance by all of the people you mentioned. But I feel like the reason why you come around with this emotion is in part because it's beautiful. I don't think it's that complex of a story. It didn't feel that complex to me. And I just kind of got annoyed with the village idiot. You mentioned that, Steph, as like sort of like caricatures, and I think sometimes they kind of bothered me, the way that Dominic was sort of portrayed in certain bits, as well as even Colin, and I don't, that maybe that just put me off a bit. And I mean, I can see the acting being really good and emotive, but certain parts sort of, it turned me off in terms of being like this caricature of a village life of, you know, in the 1920s in Ireland. And it felt like, even though I know it's an Irish person making this film, it felt slightly like a caricature of life, rural life, similarly to maybe the way that Limbo sort of kind of had that sort of impression of where it was, you know, in Scotland as well. And I just didn't, those times they made me unsettled. And perhaps maybe the same way that, as we talked about, you know, Three Billboards was quite popular in the, you know, amongst a couple of it, but I did not like that film too, because of these certain, characters of people in America that bothered me.
I do actually agree with that in a sense, like in the way of the characters and the kind of stereotypical things that we see all the time, especially when we're looking at kind of rural places and island life, especially. I think to me, in a sense, it seemed more deliberately cartoonish because you had this obviously Barry playing this kind of delinquent essentially, and this kind of almost psychopathic policeman roaming about the island with this strange, ominous old woman that seemed to be some sort of mythical person casting death upon everyone. I think that, to me, that there's a lot of it that wasn't necessarily meant to be centered in realism. I think that it's interesting with Siobhan's character. I think that she was kind of the grounding element of the whole film. She was sort of the only real person there. She sort of understood the limitations and physicality of this region and what was going on and where everyone kind of becomes stuck essentially. But I do think there was extremities in the way that, like, I suppose, like Limbo, in the sense that there was a cartoonish kind of feel to these people and there wasn't a completeness. I think that was kind of, I don't know if that was meant to be deliberate, but I do understand where Amanda's coming from for that, because I think that a lot of it was quite absurd and become even more absurd as the kind of film develops. I think that essentially where everyone was kind of distinctly simplistically oddball became quite extremely like a caricature and kind of like a representation of a person rather than actually trying to express real kind of indigenous island people in Ireland.
I'm gonna disagree with the pair, yeah, actually. And the reason I say this is, so I love In Bruges, right? I think it's an excellent film. It's one that I will happily rewatch. It kind of reminds me the most of the, because you've got the same lead pair as well. But what I will say about this film in comparison to, I would say, any of his three previous features, actually, Martin McDonagh, is he does feel a bit more emotionally mature to me. And I'm not sure that I agree with the caricature element. To a certain extent, there needs to be a little bit of caricature here because of the way that these characters are interacting and what they're maybe meant to represent. But I'm going to take Barry Keoghan's character as an example, actually. And yes, he is portrayed as the village idiot. He's basically explicitly designated so by people in the script. But I think the script itself actually gives him a bit more to do with that. He offers some insight to Colin Farrell's character about what it is that Cole maybe wants from him, right? So like, and this comes as a shock to Podrick, who's apparently meant to be significantly more intelligent than him. So like he has this level of insight and kind of observational skill that is put there in the script, and it's put there, and there is something to it. There's also an interaction he has with Siobhan, and then the way that then climaxes, that shows that he does have wants and desires, and how he may react when they are not able to be fulfilled in the location he's at. So I think, to be fair, I actually think he's portrayed as a more complex character.
That's not.
I don't think credit for.
I don't think that point is exactly that he wasn't. So I agree that the storyline is that he's smarter, or he's coming across. I think it's the way that he's portrayed within sort of even the mannerisms and whatnot that I find is slightly a caricature of someone who might be considered a village idiot, and I think that was, to me, slightly offense of what maybe would be considered a mental health situation or something. It was like it's for the story, but it's not also.
I take your point, but without some nod to it, with the character saying he is, and some mannerisms that are maybe slightly offbeat, how do you set up that contrast, though?
Well,
he's just another character.
You don't portray someone like that and then also call them that. It goes back to this thing about being funny and also tone. And I think this director gets away with sometimes tones that are slightly offensive. And for me, that's how I took it. And it's my own, it's my opinion on that. But I mean, I think other than. Yeah, I mean, I think that like the story is allowed to go through sometimes in a certain way because it's funny or there's good performances. And none of those performances I say anything against. It's just the way in which people are portrayed.
Yeah, I take that point. I think it's valid. I certainly can see that with Three Billboards, for example. For me, in this film, I thought the broadness of the characters spoke to the kind of mythologizing tone that it's kind of going for. Like it's named after Banshees. It's kind of setting itself up as this kind of Irish folktale, and plugging into that tradition of kind of Irish mythology. So I thought the kind of broadness of the archetypes that Martin McDonagh's script was bringing was kind of appropriate for that. But I absolutely take your point that these can be seen as caricatures. Which can be offensive.
I think there is quite a bit of development for Barry Keoghan's character, but I do take the point of the archetype. I do think and the representational aspect that is there. I think it's something that I think that if not for kind of the way it was kind of developed and such, it would be quite a tone and balance for me personally. I didn't necessarily find it offensive, but I do think that there are, I suppose, some limitations there. When I think I think that what kind of saved it for me is it is theatrical, it is quite play-like. Everything is a little bit otherworldly and very meant to be extremely hyperbolic, and not everything about the characters is necessarily centered within reality. Not saying that there's not very real qualities about the characters. I think that there wouldn't be any drive to the story if that was the case. But yeah, I do understand the kind of the conflicts there, especially. I think that there is a certain kind of consistency in film when it's kind of talking about rural and island life, to kind of get maybe too zoned in on the stereotypes on first hand. I suppose there could be more exploration there. So I kind of see all points in that way.
I'm gonna push back a little bit again, right? In the sense that, and I'll preface this with, I understand kind of the misgivings about potential stereotyping, particularly around Barry Keoghan's character and just kind of like him being set up as a villager. I get that, right? The thing is, though, right, we're talking about these people, like some of these characters, maybe the exception of Kerry Condon and Siobhan being caricatures, right? And that's fine, and I think that's true to a certain extent. I think it's more true for Barry Keoghan's character than the others, which is why I would understand where these come from. But I had to the way that these characters interact, even if they are slight caricatures, is more complex than the characters themselves, right? And I think Barry Keoghan's character is critical to these dynamics, because you've got Colm saying, "Oh well, I'm not going to be remembered for my aimless chats with a limited man." He's referring to Patrick. Now, in the midst of all this happening, Podrick basically then ends up spending a lot of time with Barry Keoghan's Dominic, who's meant to be, even in relation to him, a more limited man, so to speak. But he gets something out of that relationship. It allows him to find companionship, insight, understanding of the world and the other people around him. So it sets up this contrast between like how these interactions then bring value to someone's life, how you give them, but then also in the way that that Patrick will mistreat Dominic occasionally by calling him the village idiot, by not giving him his due credit. It also sets up the reverse of that dynamic, where Colm is now kind of putting upon Podrick, frankly, his own dissatisfaction with life. It's not Podrick's fault. It lies within himself. So it's more a case of I do take the point about maybe caricatures of rural life, but it's trying to take these caricatures and have them interact in a way that speaks to a slightly more universal feeling. And I think unless you set that character up, this is Barry Keoghan's character I'm talking about, unless you set that character up as being in some way seen to be, and I emphasize seen to be inferior to Podrick in some way, it's very hard to set that contrast up, and then it becomes very much just about two men fighting, right? And it is about that's the hook. But in terms of the way it then sets up and contrasts that with other people across the island with the relationships, it can't do that unless you have another character to do it. And that's why that character is there. Pretty sure if we were to sit down and restructure the film we could maybe look at it a different way. But I understand why that character is done the way it is.
Oh, I understand why. I just don't like the way that it was, and perhaps I'm finding this a consistent thing with his work that I'm responding to, and I find that's a slight around tone. And I'm now probably more interested to go see some of the other films again to see if this is just something that I'm noticing.
But the thing is, I do think you have a point there. Like, I think that's something that I would also like. I mean, I've liked all of his films, but I think that is something that is it is in there with them. I think with, I think about some of the maybe more like, to my mind, more problematic elements of, say in Bruges, Seven Psychopaths, and even Three Billboards. I personally think this one is a lot easier to justify. I think this one, to me, it feels like there is a purpose, and it is in service of the film. Some of the things I can think of in those other films, I don't know. I'm not so sure. I mean, I think the elephant in the room here, when we're talking about Three Bulls, is probably Sam Rockwell's character, and I think I probably would have looked for that to be handled differently. I don't think it's the nail in the film's coffin that I think a lot of other people find it for me, but I would do it differently. And I can point to things in the other two films where I don't really understand why it needed to be that way. And I think, as you say, Amanda, it's been gotten away with because there's humor attached to it, or there's a good performance attached to it. Here, though, I do feel like there is a thematic and narrative justification for it.
I was really sad about the donkey.
I couldn't deal with
that's
that.
heartbreaking.
I mean, that to me, that shouldn't have happened in the film. Like, I mean, it had to happen, but no, it was too much.
Yeah,
I got quite attached to that donkey quite early on, and it was just really setting myself up to cry.
yeah. I almost wanted to get a donkey like halfway through the film, and then anyway. Well, Banshees of Inisherin is out now. It's available in a lot of cinemas. So please go see it and let us know what you think. So the next film we're going to review is The Oil Machine, directed by Emma Davey. And Steph, do you want to give us your what this film's all about?
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, this documentary premiered at Sheffield's Dockfest back in June. I'm not actually sure where it's available, when it's going to be available to stream in the UK. I don't think that's been announced yet. It is coming to the Cameo Cinema for a screening in December. If anyone, any Edinburgh people, are interested in seeing it, and I think, as Amanda mentioned, it's also coming to Summerhall this month as well. So there's a few showings floating about quite soon. So yeah, I think a lot is given away in the title of the film. It is very oil centric, but with a great purpose. The film explores the cultural, economic, and historical drives and demands for oil production in the UK, and how we're becoming more entangled as a society in the fossil fuel problem. And it poses questions like, are we moving towards a new future in the coming years and moving away from pumping out these resources for profit, when we can see now more than ever what the damage that it's doing? It really dives deep into what is essentially a dependence on oil, catalyzed by an overwhelming continual greed. The documentary has many kind of experts from different industries and positions. You have activists, economists, academics, and those associated with or those who've been part of the oil and gas industries, who discuss the conflicts that are becoming kind of a barrier to change and any resolution to climate change in current society. And we're currently in COP27 at the moment, so it does resonate quite a lot just now. But yeah, for me, it was the documentary was, I found it really effective. But I'll let someone else give their thoughts on it, since I've just rambled on a bit there.
Yeah, I think it's a really striking, really interesting documentary. It kind of goes through the past, present, and future of Britain's dependency on oil. So we've got the past with like the history of the discovery of oil in the North Sea during the kind of 70s and 80s, during Margaret Thatcher's premiership, and how that could have been handled differently. We look at the present with kind of Scotland's infrastructure for getting this oil out of the sea onto the rigs and through this massive pipeline that apparently goes from Aberdeen down to just north of Edinburgh, where it's refined into plastics and whatnot. And then there's some talk about the future, and obviously this gets into discussions of climate change and how oil and fossil fuel dependency exacerbates climate change problems. There's some discussion of the plans around net zero and carbon capture, and how relying on expanding oil and gas extraction based on the idea that we'll achieve net zero just isn't happening. That's not feasible. That's not going ahead. Net zero is explicitly framed as a greenwashing front for fossil fuels, business as usual, and the fossil fuel industry carrying on the way it has. And it's obviously an open question. What will happen with oil in the future? What will happen with Scotland politically, and what will happen with Scotland's kind of ownership of this oil, with ownership in inverted commas. So I think it's a really effective documentary. There's some really striking imagery, some incredible drone shots. I liked that it kind of, the cinematography kind of represented oil rigs and oil refineries as these sci-fi dystopian, objects, these territories. And so you get a pan over the rig that looks like panning over the Nostromo in Alien, or through Los Angeles in Blade Runner. It's kind of this cheeky framing of these massive industrial things as dystopian, as otherworldly, as science fiction, which I really thought was very effective in getting the point across.
Yeah, I would largely agree with both of you in terms of the informative aspect of this film really educates in a way that's not heavy, like it's not heavy-handed in terms of saying this is, this. It really sort of explains something that I didn't. Now living in Scotland, I had no idea sort of the infrastructure of the North Sea, how it's, so connected to where we live, and I've definitely seen Grangemouth, didn't know these spaces as how it's part of this larger infrastructure, and actually went up to the northeast coast for a visit a few months ago, and saw this kind of happening, right off the coast. So I think it's super important. And I think I've spent a lot of time watching environmental documentaries over the years, and so I have strong opinions on perhaps the way things are communicated. And sometimes, again, they can be done in certain ways that is really just, its purpose seems to tell you something that is really urgent. And what has come across is that this is incredibly urgent and perhaps seriously dystopian, but between what we've been told otherwise. So, and how hard it would be to switch this stuff up, given that the governments are so involved. So it's depressing. But I do think it got me thinking more about how much more urgent this is. So I would recommend everyone to watch a film like this. In terms of the imagery and it didn't blow me away in terms of the most gorgeous film I've ever seen, or that it was doing anything like miraculously in terms of an art documentary film or whatnot. But I don't need that all the time, and I often say that, like, I don't always have to have something be an experimental art film that's whatever. I think this fits, is fit to purpose, for what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I think it's a really important documentary just now, and it is good that it is so informative. We have these conferences and protests happening all around the world, in the UK and Scotland at the moment, and we've got this, quite rightly so, this rise of green activism, and there is a great urgency, and I think that this documentary does well to capture that authentically. And it kind of confirms in many areas this is sort of where it stops. On one hand, we have academics, we have activists, even economists, and especially the younger generation raising this awareness daily. But the kind of key figures, in the position to make real change, still have their hands in their pockets. And I think this documentary does really well to explore the kind of very almost man-made obstacles and the power imbalance that runs through this issue. We have big businesses pledging transitions and plans for the next 10, 20 plus years regarding fossil fuels and carbon emissions, but unable or unwilling to provide any tangible results. It's almost another element of greenwashing, and its sole purpose is to kind of further this delay, with the hope that even more will turn a blind eye in years to come. And I think, like Simon said, it does well to relate all this back to the historic records with the North Sea, because I think, for many people, we've become quite trapped in by what we think is the success of what of these industries and what used to be. We've got these replays in the documentary of these old videos where it refers to the oil as this liquid gold, and it does encapsulate many views of what we hold today, this treasure chest of gold at the bottom of the sea, with kind of ethical considerations adrift. Because looking at the duality of these products and where this usability is no longer sustainable is where the value kind of comes into question. And as kind of the film points out, we're living in a society of what is essentially contradictions. We have kind of governments speaking out about the harm of climate change and the need for net zero commitment, so kind of funneling further investment into this industry. I would say that I do agree that the film, stylistically, the film works very well, and I think the imagery is effective. For me, I don't think we needed kind of small children showing objects and saying that what is and what is not oil. I don't think perhaps the emotional aspect that it was aiming for, because these sequences to me came off as very artificial. I think we already have quite a lot of a lot of young people in this documentary talking about their fears for the future and sharing their concerns. People talking about not wanting to have children in the world. Maybe they previously did want to, but that's more effective and authentic in my opinion. I don't think having kind of little kids read lines about oil, I found that quite distracting. But that would be my only kind of criticism with it, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree, Steph. I think it's more effective when it's got climate activists talking about their kind of eco-anxiety, their constant worry about whether or not they're going to have a future, about whether we're going to have a future. I think that is the more effective bit, because it seems more personal and less artificial, like you say. I do appreciate that it covered the history kind of briefly. I think there's more it could have gone into on kind of how Thatcher sold the oil to these big companies, on Tony Benn's alternative suggestions for kind of collective oil funds for Scotland and the UK. But it felt like it didn't need all that history. It wanted to focus, I think, on where we are and where we're going. So there's a kind of economy of narrative there that really worked for me. And like you say, Steph, tying it all into economic systems, to how oil is tangled into systems of investment banking, debt, equity, and how those reach out to actual people through pensions and mortgages is really effective, because again, it gets into that personal touch of how oil is literally a foundation of our economy, and how that plugs into our lives and human lives. So like I say, I think it's very effective. I think it's very affecting. I think it's somewhat preaching to the converted. I can't imagine. I think it's mostly the converted who will see the film. But these are still important discussions to have, particularly for Scotland's future as it stands and for humanity's future, like more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is an outreach. I mean, I know someone who's working on terms of education and outreach on this film, and perhaps, and I do agree with you, Steph, on the, this is oil, this isn't oil, and that again goes back to the fact that I wouldn't say this is a film that, I mean, it feels along the lines of other environmental films I've seen over the years, which is a genre that I appreciate a great deal. So I agree that maybe we didn't need it, but perhaps giving it back to younger people to have a voice in the film is one aspect that's important for the film, and is also important for the discussion, as you were saying, because that's the generation that needs to embrace this film as well, and and help as. So I do think it's probably maybe perhaps geared and designed to, to reach certain audiences. I mean, maybe that's one of the reasons why that's being chosen. But yeah, I think a lot of people need to see this. I do think that it's it was funded by the BBC and Creative Scotland. I do believe it'll probably be on the BBC. Did you say it's on the BBC? It will be on the BBC coming up, but I know it's, I think maybe going through it's at IDFA right now in Amsterdam, but eventually
Yeah, I
will.
don't. Yeah, I don't know if it's I don't know if it's got a set release. I would imagine it will be coming to the BBC quite soon. I wouldn't think that there'd be so much delay there. I know that it is coming to the Cameo in December, so maybe at year end we'll see more widely available. By then.
I think it was on at the GFT this past week as well.
Yeah, and it is on this week, and I was just checking it up. It's on the 18th and 19th of November in Summer Hall. But I mean, again, I think it's the idea is building a film that will reach people and inform people of a large audience that can understand or maybe need to hear those things like what you have in your hands are oil. I mean, these are kinds of maybe sort of perhaps useful in communicating an important message versus, like I said, maybe being a film that would win Berlinale awards, but really not sort of connect with a larger audience.
I didn't really have a problem with the kind of mentioning, what items were, made from oil. Like it wasn't really that. I think the fact that it was, it was quite clearly extremely sequenced, and that it came off artificially in the sense that, you've had a few kids read some lines and stuff, but and children, obviously, this is their future. They will be affected, as will we all, as we all are going to be. But I think that there probably could have been, I think, a better stylistic choice to address kind of what kind of objects are made of oil. But and again, that it is a small criticism. It didn't. I think that my initial reaction when that was the first sequence opened up was I had kind of flashbacks to watching educational videos in primary school. And I was like, please no, but it wasn't anything like that.
Well, and I think I made a similar argument with, which is not a documentary, but with the come on sort of, like going back to, like, there's something artificial about constantly going back to some gimmick idea around something. And that was very clear that this was like a framework, and maybe that framework was a little, artificial. And I don't disagree with you on that.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning it's got a very specific focus as well. Like it is thinking globally but acting locally, as the saying goes. It's talking about, there's a specific focus on Scottish towns and cities and how they will be impacted by rising sea levels caused by climate change, like Fort William, like Edinburgh. While also appreciating there's some discussion on countries like Bangladesh, which are suffering the worst impacts already, despite contributing comparatively little to global carbon usage. So that focus on Scotland and Scotland's future, Scotland's North Sea, Scotland's infrastructure is not just us putting it on the film. It is a core part of the film itself.
So look out for Oil Machine either at Summer Hall or Cameo coming up, or very likely on the BBC in the future. And I think we all think it's a very important film to watch. So please do. So the final film we're going to review is Causeway, and Simon, tell us about this film.
Yep. So Causeway is an Apple TV Plus release. It's already out on Apple TV Plus. The film follows Lindsay, played by Jennifer Lawrence. Lindsay was deployed in Afghanistan and experienced a traumatic brain injury during her time over there, which forces her to return back to the US, back to recuperate for a little bit, and then move in with her mother and return to daily life. She kind of struggles with this brain injury, with PTSD resulting from that, and gets a job cleaning pools. She meets and befriends a mechanic played by Brian Tyree Henry. His character's name is James, and they become friends. They sort of parallel each other in that they have both suffered trauma involving cars. They're both kind of recovering from that. They're kind of broken by their experience. And the film follows them as they grow in this friendship, get closer, and attempt to recover from their trauma together. Lindsay is also trying to redeploy back to Afghanistan and trying to get the all clear from her doctor to do so. So yeah, it's quite a slight film. It's quite a small story, but I found that it really drew me in and had a kind of disproportionate impact for the kind of smallness of the story and the subtlety of the performances. I'll be interested to hear what other people thought.
I did that really like this film. I think for me, my initial thoughts were kind of going into this were kind of, oh, here we go, another post-war PTSD tale. But it's not that at all. It's a film mostly about recovery and what that really means. And I think what is really effective is it is a film full of very, very loud themes and what is mostly quiet and reflective character studies.
Yeah.
We spend the film seeing Lindsay and James from the outside, which I think is quite a novel perspective. There is a lot that is still hidden, and we kind of have to interpret what their struggles, language, and behaviors kind of tell us about themselves and what their histories, because there is an air of mystery to the stories all the way through. And to me, I think that the performances in the film are fantastic. You know, we've seen from Lawrence in the past that she handles complexity with quite a lot of delicacy and respect, and here again there is a sense of kind of underperformance that makes her character more real, more human. And I think with Brian Tyree Henry, he's really hypnotic in this role. He's not someone that I'm extremely familiar with, but definitely an actor I need to see more of, because I think he was fantastic in this role. And I think that it was actually more the duo between them that really balanced this film and are kind of a perfect vehicle to kind of handle these characters' swords and stories. It's a recommendation from me. I think that it was a really new way to explore especially trauma and mental illness in film. And I think that a lot of times with things like PTSD, we kind of veer off into the sensationalist shock tactics. And, you know, I think that this film shows we don't really need to do that. I think there's more effective ways to show these struggles and these very kind of real issues. And especially I think that with war films, this can be more true. It's very much almost a hyperbolic tale of fragile people that can't really cope with the world, and this is showing people that are doing their best to kind of rejoin life. And I think that that's a really important angle to explore.
Yeah, I would agree with both. I would agree with both of the assessments that Simon and Steph have put in there. So I didn't know a lot about this film going into it, to be perfectly honest, and it kind of wrong-footed me a little bit. In that, you know, you look at it and it is it is an American production. It's got a big name attached to it in Jennifer Lawrence, who has who you could argue has kind of addressed some of these types of roles before since she became good. I mean, like, you know, you could point to the kind of a Silver Linings Playbook type thing and kind of like, you know, and you can start to see some parallels and maybe form preconceptions. And I think the very limited preconceptions I had about this film, it upended them pretty effectively. I think, as Steph said, there is a tendency, particularly I think in big star American cinema, let's say, to kind of go a little bit overboard with the emotions here, particularly when you're talking about the effects of trauma and, you know, mental health issues. And I think what I liked about this film is it understands that your reaction to these things isn't always, you know, uncontrolled and wildly emotional. Sometimes it is just you're tired and you sit in a room and just stare into space for a bit. And I think the film, it deals with that really well, whilst also putting up some very some really good character interactions and the ways that kind of like, you can kind of break through that and start to interact with people. I want to give a shout to the music. I think the music's very effective in that regard, and I think something that actually reminded me a little bit of in terms of tone is actually remind me a little bit of Leave No Trace, which is another one of these films which kind of deals with the effect of the effect of conflict on veterans and how they deal with it after. And it's interesting, there is a little bit of a circular loop here because of course that was directed by Deborah Granick, who directed Winter's Bone, which is what Jennifer Lawrence made her name with. But there was a little bit of it there, and they're very different films, don't get me wrong, but in terms of tone and kind of the mood it sets for trying to address these issues, it reminded me a little bit of that. And I found it very refreshing in that regard. It's a very contemplative film. And my only complaint with it is I probably could have done with a little bit more Brian Tyree Henry in this. I think he is. I think he's superb.
Yeah, I was going to say I would just gush about Brian Tyree Henry, full stop. But in this film, he's terrific. I don't think he's had a film role that's really broken him out. He's had film roles before, but I mainly think of his role in Atlanta, in Donald Glover's TV series, in which he's just amazing. And I think he can bring such depth to a character and say so much in silences and in very subtle gestures that really works for the quietness of this film. I think Jennifer Lawrence is good as well. It's quite a quiet.
I do think he's the standout, though.
Yeah.
I think he really is.
Yeah, I haven't seen Atlanta, right? It's something I've been wanting to see for a while, but just in terms of just to back up Simon's point, I haven't seen Atlanta, but something that actually really stuck with me with Brian Tyree Henry is he's got a very small part in If Beale Street Could Talk, right, which is a film that we reviewed on the show a long time ago, and he's not on screen for a lot, but he really is superb in that. Like, he's really excellent, and he's popped up in a couple of other things. So, on a more flippant note, I think he was in Bullet Train recently, right? And I actually rather liked him in that. I think that film was all right, but like completely different type of film to any of the ones that we've mentioned so far. But he is superb. I haven't seen Atlanta, but I do want to see more from him, and I think this is a good showcase for him. But my only complaint about the films, I would have liked to have seen more of him, because I think also the on-screen kind of chemistry he's got with Jennifer Lawrence is actually pretty good, I think.
Yeah, I will second that, because I actually thought what did detract for me sometimes Jennifer Lawrence's performance. I don't think so. There were times when, and I think I go back to what Steph was originally saying around the quietness of the film, and often worked really well when you were like sort of in the silence of trauma, that these things take time to heal, and you sort of struggle through that process of PTSD, and sort of that works really well. But there were times where there was like an emotional sort of conflict. I'm thinking this like snow cone moment or something, that it almost felt overplayed, because the rest of the film was so well timed and so well. Everything worked really well until these kind of moments where they were like, oh, put the big actors like dramatic moment in, and it didn't work as well for me. I also really loved all the pools, by the way. I'm a big fan of pools in cinema, and there was a nice pool montage and a really lovely like sort of dramatic scene in a pool that was very tense, and sort of also like sort of like sexually like tense maybe, but like questionably, and it works really, really well. And it also shows that this debut, feature film for the director, is testing stuff out in a really, like, I think the director's originally a theater director, so there was lots of kind of theatrical moments between two characters that were working really well on screen, and I think that showed. But for me, Jennifer Lawrence actually kind of, I see your connection with Silver Linings Playbook, because there were parts where I was like, oh, is this the same, but there are certain images.
Yeah, I mean, I think her performance is quite good. That's where I differ with you. But what I will say is I don't think it's anything that we haven't necessarily seen from her before, and I think she does it. I think she does it perfectly well here. But I come away from this film where the performance I'm impressed by is Brian Tyree Henry. You know, and yeah, it's not something I noticed where I was doing, but yes, and now you mentioned there are a couple of moments, I suppose, with Jennifer Lawrence's performance where, you know, it's kind of the okay, now we need to actively emote. We're going to emote now, you know, like there's a little bit of that. Whereas I feel like it came through a little bit more organically in Brian Tyree Henry's performance. It builds, and like he has, you know, he does have these moments, and we said it's a quiet, contemplative film. It doesn't have a lot of this, but you feel with his it builds, and it's a little bit more in kind of the way he looks when he delivers it, or body language, or kind of like the line delivery is less about kind of like you know acting with your whole self, you know. And I think it's really impressive.
Yeah, the film is better. It's at its best in the small moments. It's better when it's small and they're not going big. Because I was a bit put out by the kind of second act into third act, you know, falling out, big emotions. They have to have a fight because that's how these indie films go. That felt a bit formulaic and didn't really land for me, as well as some of the more subtle moments early on.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. Yeah.
I feel like in some ways, I think where the film strived when showing, especially not just so much mental trauma, but with showing the recovery process from kind of more physical trauma and more physical injury. I think my feeling when watching it was that you know, I think the people behind the filmmaking, the writing of this, the research was kind of done. I feel like I like the transition between I don't think it exploited necessarily this kind of this condition, and it sort of showed the subtle transition from, you know, the you know, balancing on balls and stuff, trying to get balance, just like even just more subtle things that went on, just kind of getting hand coordination. But I felt like the pace of how the recovery is portrayed is done really effectively. I think that it's not tried to rush into, it's not tried to be something about someone constantly falling over for dramatic effect. It's to show kind of where these struggles kind of still do linger, but they're shown as more of a long term process, which I thought that to me it seemed like there was a lot of thought behind how this was going to be portrayed, and both elements of the brain, especially with brain injuries and things. I think I found it respectful, which I really liked.
Just to pick up on Amanda's point about the pool imagery, I like that as well. I think that was a subtle and effective way of getting to the kind of class implications around of the film, in this contrast between the opulent pools that Lindsay cleans for never seen rich people who own these pools across the city, and the tiny paddling pool that her and her mother share in the back garden. I think that's a sweet contrast that really worked.
Yep.
Agreed. And there is a whole video essay on pools. It's French, but by Arts, Pools in Cinema, and I watched it over and over again because I love it. It's just a great history of pools in cinema. But yeah, highly recommend that if you're obsessed with pool imagery, as I am. On that note, I think we recommend watching this film. So check out Causeway.
So we're back, and I'm here with Patty Mraz, Belle Ingham, and Ali Campbell, who have started the fundraiser for the former CMI Staff Welfare Fund that's on GoFundMe right now. We will be sending a link so that you can donate to this really important cause. And I wanted to chat with them today and talk about the campaign, why you started it. You're part of the larger Save Film House campaign, but this was a particularly urgent action, and tell us a little bit about that process.
I guess it was just quite shocking to me to learn that people who'd been working with us for under 2 years weren't going to get their redundancy pay. and really it was also sudden, I think, finding out about film houses and CMI is kind of going into administration. It just it was such a shock, and it felt like there wasn't really much support available. I really wanted to have something there.
I'm glad Ali reached out to me to help organize it, because I agree it's a very good idea. I'm one of this former staff that's been there under 2 years, and there's things like lots of my notice on a contract was 4 weeks, but when claiming for government I'm only getting a week, and there's a lot of people like me and people who have children who are in precarious financial situation and might not be able to find a job straight away. So I think this is very important to have and support people whilst they're looking for a job. Yeah.
I think it's worth considering as well, Filmhouse was very much a place where people progressed. So there were a lot of people who felt very invested in the film industry and in cinema. When you got a job at Filmhouse, it kind of meant something. So I think for people to have to make such sudden decisions about what they were doing next is really difficult. So, the idea, and I was approached about helping out, was that this would give people a sort of a cushion so they could have a bit more time to consider what their next steps were. And obviously it's a really difficult financial situation for everyone, and having the concern of having no job might put people in positions where they won't have the chance to properly consider what their next career steps are. So I thought it was really important that we made sure that there was support for staff to make good decisions, and have a bit more kind of autonomy in what's been quite an unautonomous process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you bring up a really good point, Belle, that the Film House was one of the places, as a former film exhibition curation student, the Film House jobs and potential jobs was one of the places where people very much were looking at the start of their career in terms of in film and film exhibition and a long-term career. So it's a huge loss for everyone. Now, can you talk a little bit about how you kind of came up with the idea in terms of the structure? Like, I think one thing that Ali, you mentioned, is to be really transparent about this. Where is the money going specifically, and where would it go outside of if you raised more? And I'm also curious how you feel about the overall reception so far.
So it's roughly 30 to 40 people who are under the 2 years. So we wanted to kind of aim to cover those 40 staff members. So that's where we've kind of come up with this number on a banded system to kind of cover people's different working hours. And we're hoping to publish the bank statements kind of every 2 weeks to just kind of give people a bit of clarity about where the money is going. We're hoping to pay people kind of weekly increments of the monthly total. It's 1 month's pay at the living wage, or the real living wage of £10.90. Yeah, that's kind of the structure of it.
How are you feeling about the reception so far? Your goals are, is 50,000. We're already, I think, at this stage around 9,000. That's and there's also quite a lot of people who have donated. But of course, we're here to get the word out for more people to donate. Have you felt people have been, very receptive, and how have you felt overall of around this?
I think it was we started off really well, and people are still very generous and have shared lovely messages when donating, and it's been so surprising to see how so many people genuinely care and want to help. I've noticed that it's very much like peaks and troughs, which is a thing we would say at Film House. With the donations, depending when an article would come out or something, we try to share it with different people and sources. So whenever a thing would be published promoting it, we'd go for a peak. So we're trying to keep the momentum going so people don't just forget about it, because, as I said, more and more people are reaching out, more former employees asking for financial help, and it would be good to be able to help them. And Yeah, I know there's people that have dependents and have worked under 2 years and have quite a specialist job. So it'd be a shame if they were not able to continue in their current career path, because they need to just get any job they can at the moment. Yeah, I'd like to just support people to progress in their area of expertise and not lose it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're here to try to figure out a way to do that. So we'll continue to help as much as possible to find a way to spread the word. Patty, you've also been very instrumental in putting together the Safe Film House website, which shares a lot of stories as well. Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was a really lovely a way that you guys have organized the website between telling the stories and telling sort of more of the history, or more of like with the ethos of Film House. And I think that was fantastic.
I was approached by a former person I worked with at the Film House Vigil, and she has shared with me, being like, why don't you guys, because I was talking to her about all the different things Film House did, about education, about things about programming, how people developed in their roles, etc. And she said, why don't you guys make a website to actually highlight all the things you did, all the festivals you've worked with, all the things that other cinemas did not do, all the things that you were like experts at, because this is not known to everyone. Because as she was saying, like, as much as I went to Film House because I like the independent cinema, I did not know about like all the things that you're telling me you've done now. So not many people will know about how important this is to the community, because there's so many different things that Film House was doing, whether it was for young people, for the elderly, for people from other countries having festivals in their home language. I took the idea on, and I spoke to a couple of the former employees, heads of education and some of the projection team. Then I spoke to others as well and asked them what they thought of the idea, and like making a thing of every department, and inform people what we actually did, so it doesn't just disappear into ether. So there's like solid concrete words telling you this is what we did and this is what we'd like to continue doing and this is why it's important. So I've reached out to the person, Andrew, who has made the initial website, and asked for his help. And I was like, would you be okay if I did this? Because we as former employees feel it'd be good to highlight all the things that Film House did. And I've got contacts who will be able to help me build the blocks of text, etc. So I just started like a website from scratch. I've contacted David Boyd, I've contacted Rod White, I've also contacted other people for stories, because first, one of the last emails that was received in the admin inbox was from Undine, which is also shared on Twitter, and it was really, really lovely. It was shared to us in the WhatsApp, former employees WhatsApp group. And we're like, oh wow, this is nice. And when Ali and I were talking, we should add something like sweet, because this would be a really good idea to like also like show the emotional side of it, how much impacted people's lives. So we also started the stories section of the website, not just, oh, this is what we did. And we keep on getting submissions, and the stories are really sweet and moving. There's people who have like confessed us that they've watched their first ever short film at Film House, and like there's been quite a few like really nice stories, heartwarming, and I think they're important because it lets people express themselves and their love for Film House, because it meant a lot to people that aren't just employees. It also meant a lot to the community. Yeah, so we're just trying to like make people aware of what a great thing it was. I think that's came from mainly. Yeah.
I think by having that awareness and like asking people for their stories and asking them to reflect as well, I think that's brought together the community really nicely. People have been able to connect and think about it, and I think that's made members of the public feel part of our community as well. I think a lot of us who worked at Film House also had similar stories before we worked at Film House. It's a real community, and it's been really nice to have the story section where people have been able to share things, to kind of build a community of cinema lovers, of film house attenders, of people who have been touched by film house in some kind of way. So having the stories thing is kind of built into the wider website that Patty's worked on in terms of just stories and creating an oral history for ourselves.
I just add a wee thank you to the Edinburgh Short Film Festival. They've been really supportive, and they've let us kind of just do a wee introduction before their screenings. And people have been so generous there, and it was very kind of them to let us fundraise there. So it's just a thank you to them.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's as you've all articulately and really importantly expressed, this was a community, and the work that the former CMI staff was doing was very, very specialized and very important part of our community, and it was and it really showed how passionate everyone is around film, but also the specific type of cultural sort of offer that wouldn't, and education and everything that wasn't. So I think everyone really appreciates the work that you have done right here to create this GoFundMe for the former staff, and we should really help as much as possible, which is why we're here. We'll send the link. Is there, you could definitely just go to go to savethefilmhouse.com to get to the link, as probably the easiest way, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, so please go there and support this GoFundMe. And Patty, Belle, and Ali, thank you so much for your time. We wish the fundraiser the best success.
Thank you.
I'm back, and I'm here actually with Jim Hickey, who was the director of the Film House from 79 to 93. Jim, thank you so much for letting us do this interview with you and talking a little bit about the history of the Film House. I really appreciate you being here.
No, pleasure to be here.
So I read a little bit about your history, and actually it got me into learning a little bit more about the film festival. Now, can you kind of give us an overview of the festival? Is 75 years old. It's said to be the continuously running oldest film festival in the world, but the Film House is 40 years old, or 40 plus now. I went to hear you speak at the Film House a few years ago on the 40th anniversary. How did that all come about, the film festival and the Film House, and how are they connected?
Well, the Film House, before it took over this church in Lothian Road in 78, 79, it had a base run by the Edinburgh Film Guild, which is the oldest continuously running film society. They owned the building in the West End of Edinburgh, in Randolph Crescent, which the film festival used, and they founded the film festival in 1947. So they had a small cinema in one of their earlier buildings, and they moved to Randolph Crescent and had a basement cinema there and offices. And so they were able to operate as this film society, but they started the film festival in 47. And initially it was a documentary film festival. So it really just showed documentaries, but it had gradually got lots of invited films from different countries. I mean, it's different from the days that Linda Miles and myself experienced, where we would travel to lots of festivals and look at lots of films and select stuff. What was happening then was quite often an official entry from a country would be submitted to the festival, and the festival would show it. That's where the film festival began, through that film society. And eventually Linda and I got to work. We met at university. We worked together on the film society there. We made it along with her partner at the time, David Will, we made it into a society with like 2,000 members, and we would show one film each week at the local Odeon cinema, which had 1,500 seats, so we could get most of the members to one screening. And it broadened out into 2 nights a week, usually double bills. So Dave and Linda were really fanatical about film. They used to go to the Cinematheque in Paris to look at films. They knew a lot more than I did, but we were all really passionate about learning more about cinema. It was the days of people talking about auteurs, emphasizing the role of the director more than anything else. And so Edinburgh began to do a series under Murray Grigger, who was the director in 1967. He started to do retrospectives. So with the help of Dave and Linda, he would be doing, there would be retrospectives of Sam Fuller, of Roger Corman, Douglas Sirk, Raoul Walsh. And these were an attempt to show people the complete works, or as near complete as they could get, of one particular filmmaker. I mean, it got to the point with the Raoul Walsh retrospective where we actually showed 48 of his films during the festival. So it was really very rigorous, and it was done alongside lots of people working in the British Film Institute in London, who were doing a lot of the writing and helping with the programming. The National Film Archive would chase down prints from other archives or collectors, and allowed Edinburgh to be this focal point each year. And a lot of those people from London would come up to the festival as well, people interested in cinema, people who wrote about cinema or taught it even. So they would come to Edinburgh as a fixture in their year. It just became somewhere where they all got together. So Linda took over from Murray, and throughout the 70s, I worked as her deputy director.
So it was really interesting to read too that, as you said, this connection between the Film Guild and also your connection with the Film Society, how much these film societies really built this, and what became the Film House and the Edinburgh International Film Festival, and they're so tied together, which is really fascinating. And also that John Grierson started the film festival, or he was one of the people.
That's right, yes. And Forsyth Hardy was his biographer. I mean, the main book on Grierson is by Forsyth Hardy. And in one of the years in the 70s, we had a documentary 50 event where a lot of these people, not Grierson then, he died, but there were people like Basil Wright, all came to the festival. All these old documentary British filmmakers were all there, but there was also Don Pennebaker from America. He was there too, because of course, his more recent documentaries at that time were things everybody wanted to get hold of. He was one of the pioneers of our kind of generation, as distinct from the Grierson generation.
Yes, and so you started to mention that there was Cinema 2, and that's interesting. Is that the current Cinema 2?
That's right, yes.
That was the first cinema and the current on 88th Lothian Road, and then you worked to develop and get money to make the Film House 1.
Yeah, and that finally opened in 82. So it took 3 years of work and fundraising to complete Cinema 1, and the foyer, obviously in the box office area, and to open the front doors, because when we only had Cinema 2, people had to go through the back lane to the rear entrance of the building. But once we got to 82, people were able to go in the main door, and the area that was to become the cafe bar was completely walled off. You couldn't go through there, so that you'd go through a narrow tunnel through the back to Cinema 2, and you go up the stairs to Cinema 1. So that functioned for the following 3 years till the cafe bar opened, and then the whole building was open by that time.
And how did the cafe bar kind of bring a different energy to did it bring more people in, or was it helpful in terms of keeping the film house alive in terms of finances, or I'm just always very curious on how all these things work together?
Yeah, well, it became the thing that all of the film theatres similar to Filmhouse, everybody began to realize that you needed more than just, a box office and a cinema. You actually needed to have a place where people could meet and people could sit and enjoy being together and spending time in the building and spending money, obviously. So it became crucial for most cinemas of this kind of generation. And so the bar and cafe were essential actually for income to boost what takings we were getting at the box office, because you really did need that extra money. And it made the place something that people wanted to come to more often. It was somewhere where they'd arranged to meet. And it was also lucky that in Lothian Road, we were in an area where there was the Usher Hall, where there were lots of concerts and events going on. There was the Traverse Theatre and the Lyceum Theatre. So there was a whole cultural quarter in that small area of Edinburgh, which became very important, that audiences that would go to the Usher Hall or to the Traverse Theatre would come to Filmhouse to have a meal beforehand or go to Filmhouse for a drink after they'd been to the theatre. Yeah. So you had enough people interested in other things coming to Filmhouse and probably learning that it was a safe place to be. I mean, women could come. This sounds ridiculous, but women were happy to come to the bar and cafe there alone, whereas normally on Lothian Road you might not be, because there's a lot of pubs on Lothian Road. The weekends and Friday nights were always quite noisy. Often there was a period where we put a guard on the front door on Friday for the late night film that we would show, to stop people just wandering in who were drunk and so on. All those problems that you have when you've got a public building. You've got to deal with it and make sure people feel secure. And we learned quite quickly that women felt very secure coming there. They would meet in the mornings for coffees and things, before screenings starting at 2:00. The place was quite busy at lunchtime. So we began to realize that, the loyal audience that a cinema like this needs was beginning to develop. And we were, once we had the front doors open and it was visibly a cinema and you could walk in, there was no membership, there was no club involved. So you didn't have to sign up to anything. You could just walk in and treat it like a normal cinema. It seems that it's disappeared at the moment, and all efforts are being made to try and replace it or get it back open again.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a really good point, and something where I've always come to the Filmhouse for meetings, and it's a comfortable space. And I think people often don't realize how important a space to feel safe and comfortable, quiet, or to be able to be in for hours. And whether and it really was that public space, regardless of the cinema, that was really important for Edinburgh. And
sure,
people think about glossy kind of places that you can have fancy cocktails, but also to draw certain people, but you also need a place where you feel very comfortable to spend, that almost feels like a home away from home. And Edinburgh's Filmhouse always did. It's really interesting that it started, obviously the Filmhouse started and it's in the location where it has been last, in the early 80s, as you say. Because that's interesting, because a lot of film houses or a lot of cinemas went away way before that. There's so many cinemas in the UK and Edinburgh for years and years and years. When do you think Filmhouse itself, this one on 88 Lothian Road, maybe had its heyday, or was it always very busy over the years?
Well, it's a good point you make, because when I took on the job in '79, it was probably the worst time to be thinking about creating another cinema, because in the UK, attendances were plummeting. Cinemas were being closed. Old style cinemas with 1,500 seats were not getting audiences that were big enough to keep them running, and it definitely felt like the the cinema as we knew it was beginning to just disappear. And here we were deciding to build and raise money for a new building to show more films. But we knew that it would be programmed. We knew that the film house would be showing films that nobody else was showing, and it would seek out things that were ones that we believed were great films. Equally, it would put on new films. It would work with distributors and the British Film Institute to program films that were of the moment, and to do little mini seasons and retrospectives and things like that. So we had a kind of, I suppose, I mean, it's perhaps not the right word to use, but a sort of educational element to it. So during the early 80s, it was the worst time for cinemas. Yeah. And it was the multiplexes opening in roughly mid-80s, 84, 5, that changed everything. Because then suddenly there was cinemas with 8 or 10 or 12 screens showing lots of different films, sometimes the same film in several screens when they're really busy. And that persists even to today, of course. But I remember people saying to me when we'd completed and opened Film House, there was a guy came up to me and he said, oh, this sort of building, you know, it'll be gone in 10 years. You know, they'll all be gone by then. Nobody will want this kind of thing. And we couldn't believe anyone would think that, you know, because we assumed that always there would be an audience for cinema. We couldn't conceive of a day when we would have to close, because the catalogue of film history that we were drawing from was vast. And, you know, even if we never showed a new film, we would have so many great films that we could be showing and programming in interesting and different ways that would keep the cinema alive and keep people coming. So there's a lot of flexibility about how we programmed and worked with distributors and worked with archives and so on. But yes, it was a tough time, but we gradually got through it, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like it was a tough time, and also it's not an easy time now, and people could easily say, oh, there will be no cinemas, you know, in 10 years. But there are so many, if you would call cinephile or cinema loving audiences like that want this kind of retrospective or sort of cultural cinema offer, and to not have that in Edinburgh is devastating. I mean, you say that your colleagues at the Film Society, Linda, were cinephiles and they went to the Cinematheque, which I'm super fascinated to know about anyway. What drew you to doing this for so long? And what was your favorite part of working as the director of the Film House? Was it the festival? Was it?
I kind of liked all of it. I mean, it seems a bit obvious, but I liked all the elements of it, because going to festivals, we didn't have a lot of money, but we would go, and I followed Linda in this, that the main ones we would go to each year were Rotterdam and Berlin at the beginning of the year. They'd be around about February every year, and Cannes in May, because by the time we got to Cannes, we would be looking at films that would be opening in the UK in the autumn. British distributors would use the festival as a kind of launch pad, because they knew that it would get reviews at the festival, that a film being shown in a festival atmosphere and possibly filling, you know, one of the big cinemas like the Playhouse in Edinburgh, which had 3,000 seats at one time. We would be filling that with 1 or 2 performances every festival, but equally all the films were taken, all of the films were given as much prominence as we could give them, especially helping to get the directors there, so the directors would spend time with audiences. The things that are just taken for granted almost today, that's what you do. But that was good. But I also enjoyed the way in which back in Edinburgh we watched this thing grow. You know, we were watching it year by year, getting better and better. And I think by the late 80s we were getting something like 3,000 people a week coming to the 2 cinemas that were open then. And so it was really an exciting time. We felt we'd made it, you know, once we got past 86, 87, we really felt Film House had come into its own, and we couldn't conceive of it ever disappearing.
I really loved your discussion about, this world international film community that you met at Berlinale is one of my favorite film festivals I've had the opportunity to go to. But Edinburgh became something that, as you were saying in a previous question, really became super well known for as the preeminent UK film festival. And it also has a different feel to it. I mean, maybe it's slightly, for me, it feels slightly more intimate because it's very much connected to the film house. How do you think you, as part of, and Linda and the other people that you worked with during that time, sort of crafted a festival that was unique, but it was also sort of on the international kind of landscape as one of the top film festivals in the world?
Well, I think it was the way that Edinburgh looked after filmmakers. I think that was a really crucial thing, that we would make sure that as best we could, we would get the filmmakers to come to the festival. And I remember us saying very early on when we were doing the job back in Murray's day, that each filmmaker who comes to the festival has to believe that theirs is the most important film in the festival. You have to treat them all as equally as you can. Now, that's difficult if you've got Martin Scorsese coming, because you've got a retrospective of his films, and therefore the distributor expects lunches or dinners and hotels being paid and so on. And a lot of it was a balancing act between trying to cover as many of the filmmakers as we could, but also being glad of any distributors that would pay for their filmmaker to come because they were on a circuit where they're heading off to the German launch and the French launch of their film or whatever it is. So Edinburgh could be built into their itinerary. But the thing about all of that meant that those people were going away and telling other filmmakers, Edinburgh's the place to go. This is somewhere you should get your film next year, because you get looked after, you meet amazing people, the quality of projection and the comfort of the cinemas, and all these things count. And Edinburgh was as good a place as, in its size, for its size, it was as good a place as you could go to in those days.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's interesting. It's a word of mouth as well, and the experience that you create. It's like there's something really tangible about that, and that's amazing. How over the years, you've been, you were part of it till 93, you said.
That's right, yes.
Why did you decide to move on? I think you said you went on to produce films, which you said originally you had wanted to do anyway. Why did you decide to move on and pass the baton on to somebody else?
Just to go back a few years just before that, it came to the point where the film festival was looking at, financially always in trouble. It never quite had enough money. It was always in a position where the grants were never quite enough, and you can't do everything on box office alone. A festival needs subsidy, and it wasn't perhaps getting as much as it should have had for many years. But I'd done 8 festivals as a director by that time, 1988, and I felt I'd done it long enough. And because I'd worked in the 70s as well. So, I thought it was time somebody else came in, that, you need young blood, you need a different approach to the festival within the parameters that have been established, but, there may be someone who, would spend a lot of time showing non-English language films, or, seeking out filmmakers that we never had the money to go and find, or to travel to see those films. Maybe somebody new would have the contacts, would be able to go places that we never went. And I just thought, my attention has got to be with Film House at the moment, because the cameo was representing a threat to eat away at our audience, possibly. And I felt that also I could work with a new director on sort of fusing the work of the film festival and Filmhouse in more interesting ways, that we could do events that linked into the festival, knowing what it was likely to do the following year, or even, capitalizing on something that happened at the film festival. So it was, we used to sort of say, well, Filmhouse ought to be a year-round festival. And in many ways, it did become that, I think, and has been for quite a few years. But what happened then was the two organizations were divided, and a new director was appointed for the film festival, and I carried on programming Filmhouse. But I also felt, I was by then in my 40s, and I thought, if I don't do it now, if I don't leave now, yes, I could happily stay here, but people would be bored with me. I probably would not remain as fresh as I could have been, and maybe it wouldn't have been a good idea to stick around much longer. And I thought, well, if I go now, this would be the best time to do it. And I've had no regrets, and I did go on and make some films, and it was tough, and not having a salary, working in that world where you're spending months with no income, and then occasionally a film got made. But it was tough. But everybody finds it tough. Getting into production is not easy, and it's no easier now than it was then. Although there are different ways of making films now that weren't available in the early 90s. But I have no regrets about it.
Jim, thank you so much for taking the time. I think it's so important to hear this. It's something that I really value, you taking this time to go through the history.
And I think also, just to finish, there was one thing that did happen, I think, that Murray Grigger leading to Linda Miles, leading to me running the festival, you had this wonderful kind of overlap of people who worked together for a short period in the sort of changeover period. And it's almost like the film festival grew organically from this, that, we all were moving in the same direction, as it were. And it was at a time when that was needed. There was a kind of stability about how film festival grew during the late 60s onwards. And I think that got a bit lost suddenly. It needed that sort of transition of people who understood each other and understood what Edinburgh meant, and tried to keep that going. But that, I'm talking a long time ago. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm talking about years where most of the people who are caring about Filmhouse and worried about it at the moment are younger people who weren't even born when I was doing what I was doing. So I can't tell them, it will come, it will grow out of this movement, hopefully, that it'll all get redefined and things will change, hopefully.
Well, I think it does matter to a lot of people who are younger, and it's in part, I think that's a really good point you mean about the kind of transference of skills, and it's a good time for us to reflect on how maybe we can improve going forward, and and here, because it's decades long of learning here. And so I would talk to you for many more hours, and I really appreciate it. So thank you for taking the time to talk. So I really thank you again.
Hey, thank you. I enjoyed it.
This wraps our November edition. Big thanks to Patty, Ali, and Belle, and Jim for joining us around the story, what's happening with the Filmhouse and CMI. Again, please go to savethefilmhouse.com to support this former CMI welfare fund if you can in any way. Share, and thank you to Simon, Steph, and Jim for joining again. So it's November and mid-November, and we're thinking holiday time. I think there's already lots of Christmas movies happening on Netflix. So I'd love to challenge this team, the greater Cinetopia team, who's also listening, to a good and bad. You can choose what you want. I am starting with the Lindsay Lohan film. I think it's like Falling for Christmas or something like that. So I challenge you to watch that because it's easy to watch.
I mean, we all know the film. It's going to be a poster with two people on it. It's going to be green and red font of some sort with a Christmas tree in the background.
It's out.
Find that one with Lindsay Lohan. That's probably the one.
It's out now, so you can get your head start if you'd like on the Christmas films. Do you?
Good Lord, it's not even Thanksgiving yet.
Do you all have a film to challenge the rest of the team to watch? Best or worst, your pick.
Yeah, so I've been unwittingly preparing for this feature for 4 years or so, because me and my partner, we watch bad Christmas films throughout December. Like I don't watch any serious films. It's all about the bad Christmas films. Just go to Netflix and type in Christmas and watch the first thing that comes up. Who cares? Go for it. So we do that. So I've got quite a few. So I'd say my anti-recommendation is a film we tried to watch last year and couldn't get through, despite our high tolerance for bad Christmas, which is Father Christmas is Back, which is a film with Kelsey Grammer and John Cleese, and it's kind of a bawdy 70s comedy, but it was made last year. It doesn't work at all. That's an anti-recommendation. For my recommendation, I would say we watched a film called Dear Christmas, which, because we're on the radio, because we're on a podcast, is appropriate. It's about a podcaster at Christmas. She's like struggling to balance her successful podcast with her family. You know how these things go. It's worth watching just for the scene where she records the podcast and then goes into the other room and proclaims, "Well, we've gone viral," as if that's how podcasting works. So that's Dear Christmas. I don't know where it's available to stream, but yeah.
Okay, Dear Christmas sounds good, because I do believe Isabel last year highly didn't recommend your anti-recommendation.
Yeah,
so...
don't watch that one.
So we can manage Dear Christmas. Steph, do you have a recommendation?
I have an anti one. I'm going to be honest. I've never been a massive Christmas film watcher. My go-to one every year is Gremlins. That's my favorite one.
Yeah.
My anti one, actually, to be honest with you, I would be lying if I said that I didn't actually quite like it. It's absolutely awful, but I loved it. It's almost like I wouldn't really call it a horror. I think that's what it's listed as. I wouldn't worry too much about that for people that don't watch them. It's an old slasher film from the 80s called Christmas Evil. I saw it in an all-night screening before, and it's just the most ridiculous film I've ever seen about someone who essentially has a nervous breakdown over Christmas. It's done very, very offensively, probably. Retrospectively, it's not done well. It's about a man who makes toys and suddenly just cracks up, and well, I don't want to give too much away, really. There's but definitely go and watch it. I don't know where it would be streaming, if it's streaming anywhere. My best bet on this one would be to check Amazon Prime. They've always got some. If you can't find that one, they've always got some hidden gems for the worst of the worst, especially during Christmas.
Christmas Evil, that's what it's called. What?
Yeah, Christmas Evil. Well, I think that. Yeah, I think I'm sure it goes by another name as well. I think it's something like You Better Watch Out is also its alternative name, if that does not come up. But it's a blast, to be honest.
Okay, and since this is your favorite challenge of the year, Jim, would you have a film to add to the challenge?
I'm not sure we do, but I do have a question. Did everybody on this call make it through A Castle for Christmas then?
No. I've not seen it yet, but I'm definitely going to watch it tonight.
All right, well, I'm going to make you. Fine, I'm making you watch A Castle for Christmas then, because
Castle for Christmas, Christmas Evil, Dear Christmas, and Falling for Christmas are our 4 films to challenge. Maybe we can watch. Yeah, if you get through all of them, good luck.
I made it about half an hour into a Castle for Christmas. Easter eggs to watch out for anybody who's familiar with Scotland. Keep an eye out for the route that her taxi takes when she gets to Scotland.
Yeah,
right?
love that.
Right, just keep an eye out for that, right? And if you have any local knowledge, kind of like the location you go to, it is batshit. It is absolutely batshit. But anyway, I will leave those delights for when you're watching the film.
And the oatcakes for rain, oatcakes in the rain, which you commented on.
One phrase. I'm going to give a shout out as well. We mentioned Gremlins. I just want to give a quick shout out to Queen's Park Arena in Glasgow, who do outdoor screenings. They're showing cult and classic Christmas films all through December in Glasgow City Centre. So I've got tickets for Gremlins, but I might pick up tickets for, I don't know, Home Alone as well, Muppet Christmas Carol.
Amazing. I was trying to suggest an outdoor Christmas thing here and everyone said Burr, but I'm very, very excited to know that Glasgow is doing outdoor Christmas films.
We're made of harder stuff in Glasgow.
Clearly.
Cold schmold. Get the jacket on, a bit of mulled wine. You'll be fine.
Like, how about some Christmas films in Princess Street Gardens? And everyone goes Burr, but
No, it's worth it for Gremlins.
Yeah.
Simon, I think that you should suggest that they screen the Dear was it Dear Christmas?
Merry Christmas. I'll email them. I'll go and do an introduction. I don't care.
All right. Well, thank you very much for those very fine recommendations. We will report back. Our challenge has been set. And thank you for joining us on this edition of the Cinetopia radio show and podcast. We will see you next month.